Hi, I'm Jeffrey Phillips, Associate Pastor of Winnetka Congregational Church. Thank you for joining us with this session of Spiritual Enrichment, our adult education and faith formation ministry at Winnetka Congregational Church. Before I introduce our presenter for today, I'd like to begin our session as we always do with a time of quiet and centering so that we can experience the Spirit's presence within and between us. And given the events of the world around us in recent days, it's probably more important now that we are able to settle down within, to calm our minds and spirits, to find that space within each of us where God's Spirit is full and present to us so that we can be more effective in our daily living. So I invite you to be comfortable wherever you are, perhaps with your feet on the floor, and with nothing in your hands. I just put down what was in my hands. To close your eyes and to take a couple of deep breaths to begin. And I'll lead you in this simple breathing meditation that comes from the Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. Breathing in, I am aware of my in-breath. Breathing out, I am aware of my out-breath. Breathing in, I am aware of my in-breath. Breathing out, I am aware of my out-breath. Breathing in, I follow my in-breath all the way through. Breathing out, I follow my out-breath all the way through. Breathing in, I am aware of my whole body. Breathing out, I am aware of my whole body. Breathing in, I am aware of my whole body. Breathing out, I am aware of my whole body. Breathing in, I heal my body. Breathing out, I heal my body. Breathing in, I heal my body. Breathing out, I heal my body. I'd like to introduce our guest for today. He is Sam Fifer. Today is the final offering of Spiritual Journeys in a 2 or 3 week segment of Spiritual Journeys. A couple of weeks ago, we heard from Asif Masood, a friend of Winnetka Congregational Church, and he told his faith journey. And today, Sam will share some of his faith journey too. When we hear faith journeys by others, it's beneficial for us because it causes us to reflect on our own faith journey and to hear in another person's journey a way in which our own journey is present and validated as an important spiritual journey. Sam Fifer is someone I have known for a long time. He was part of this congregation when I served at this church 20 years ago as an interim associate pastor. So it's been very nice to reacquaint myself with Sam. Sam was born in Chicago, educated in the Chicago public schools. He attended Northwestern for college and DePaul for law school. Sam is married, he has 2 grown children, 1 grandchild, and he has lived in Winnetka for almost 30 years. Sam is an avid amateur photographer, an earnest but bad piano player, so he says. An insatiable reader of history and biography and a devoted sports fan, with season tickets for the White Sox and the Blackhawks. He also says here he gave up the lyric opera subscription after seeing Carmen for the 5th time. I mean, seriously? He writes. Sam has 4 jobs: a lawyer in private practice, working as a partner at Denton's, a worldwide law firm, where he specializes in intellectual property and media law. He also serves as an adjunct professor at Northwestern's Law School and as a catechist in the Roman Catholic Church and a volunteer lawyer for the Catholic Charities Legal Assistance. Welcome back to Winnetka Congregational Church, Sam Fifer. Tell us about your story.
Well, Jeffrey, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's sort of returning to the scene of many prior crimes. Spent a lot of time in this particular room involved in adult education in one form or another, either as an organizer and prevaricator or presenter or mere witness, but those are all kind of useful things. So, given that we have a short period of time, I'm going to try to hit the highlights, but I'm going to say something that occurred to me as you were introducing me. I tend to think that you don't know that you're on a spiritual journey after you've been on it for some time. You'll say, okay, how did I get here? And then you might look back and say, oh, these are the turns I made, these are the choices I made, and this is how I got here. Because I can guarantee you that when you're doing them, they don't seem like anything, remotely resembling a journey. They just seem like the most compelling thing to do under the circumstances, and so it is with me. So there was a time on a Sunday in, I'm going to say about 1998, that in that room over there, I got into the pulpit and sort of gave a version of this. It was about a 5-minute speech. And so the highlights are these. So I was born into a Jewish family. My parents they're now both deceased, Holocaust survivors, which is a very interesting way to grow up. They were both immigrants that came to this country after World War II from Poland, their native land, a place which I've gone to visit since, which that's a whole other 45-minute conversation. And did all the things that a Jewish lad would do, bar mitzvah, went to Hebrew school, learned how to read, not speak very well, but write Hebrew, got very familiar with Old Testament writings. And I remember at an early age, somewhere around 11 or 12, asking one of the rabbis, and I said, who is this Jesus character? Because you would hear a lot about him in places other than in the synagogue or in Hebrew school. Frequently, it was a name evoked when your hammer missed and you hit your thumb, but that's terribly irreverent. I regret it immediately. But and what was interesting was the kind of answer that one of the rabbis gave me. He got very grim and he sort of took a breath in and said, well, he was a great teacher. And kind of sort of got out of control. I mean, that's my summary of what he said. So, okay, all right, great. But that answer, as I think is frequently the case with young people, was not enough. But I shelved it, and years later, kind of came back to it. So I'm going to say this as kind of an organizing statement. Like my namesake, the prophet Samuel, I was called 3 times during my life. Samuel was called 3 times within about 5 minutes while he slept on the floor of the temple and kept waking the priest Eli up. And if you want to read it, it's in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 through 10. And what happened there really did happen to me, but not exactly in that same way. And I'm not going to admit to hearing voices, but a call in a religious context like this is, I can think of it as like a tug, or it's like a hand on your shoulder that isn't really there in a physical, corporeal way. So I experienced this call 3 separate times, and I wrote this down because it's important. In 1975, again in 1985, and in the year 2009. So in 1975, I was a lawyer working, very hard, and one of the clients I actually worked for was the Catholic Archdiocese of Chicago, which has legal issues the way any billion-dollar organization does. And I became intrigued. I worked on some cases for the Archdiocese, and I started to do things like pull books off of shelves and start reading about Catholicism, but also the New Testament, and which was forbidden territory, I have to understand, for someone in my upbringing. It was if you take a Bible, and I have this prop here. I have a Bible, right, and it's a New Revised Standard Edition. The New Testament is like this much, and the Old Testament is that much. It's like 8 to 1 if you do a page count, so it was there was a little timidity when I started to do that, but I was intrigued and fascinated, and then ultimately distracted and went back to other things. So that call was not profound enough to alter my path. So in 1985, I got a call again. And at that point, I was married to Barbara, who many of you watching will remember. And she was raised in the Lutheran tradition. And she liked to go to church, so I went with her. It was I was her driver, companion, husband, and all that kind of thing. And I was fascinated by the whole thing. But then I felt, in effect, in the grip of, who is Jesus? And there, for a scriptural reference, I would give you the Acts of the Apostles. It's in chapter 5, and it's roughly verses 28 through 40. And it's a great story, and the story is Gamaliel, the great rabbi, and great teacher. So there were two great teachers at that period of time. There was Hillel and Gamaliel. And the folklore says that Jesus was a student of Hillel. Gamaliel was, the other, it's like the red state, blue state kind of thing. And in the early church, which is the chronicle of the Acts of the Apostles, that great volume 2 by Luke, written for the unknown Theophilus, we come to the point where Peter and a number of the disciples are running around Jerusalem preaching the resurrection of Jesus, this criminal who had been murdered by the Romans, and saying that he was in fact much bigger than anyone thought he was, and in fact had risen from the dead and conquered death, and is God personified. So the Sanhedrin had arrested these men and said, we got to do something about that. And so they were in the council chamber, and Gamaliel said, send them outside. So he then lectures his colleagues and says, where we live, messiahs pop up all the time. They're like cactus in the desert. When it rains, they pop up, but then they wither and die. And he named them, and he said, well, there was this one, and he had a number of people who followed him, but he came to nothing. And then there was the other one, and he was killed and came to nothing at all. So let's do the same thing with this Jesus fellow. Because if he's nothing, it'll come to nothing, and we'll have nothing to worry about. But if he's the real deal, we won't be able to stop it. And we might find ourselves fighting against God. So the members of the Sanhedrin said, well, that sounds good. So they called the men back in, beat them, and told them not to preach. And of course, they completely ignored them and went out and preached. And well, this church is here, and that's evidence that the preaching took hold. So so I came into the grip of all of that. And I went to one of the pastors at the Ebenezer Lutheran Church and said, I think I'd like to be baptized. Well, he about fell on the floor and picked himself up, and I was baptized at the tender age of 35 in 1985. Don't do the math. And so there I was. So I went from apostasy, being outside the faith, to heresy, being, fellow heretic here, right? It's all good fun. In just the snap of the fingers. And, when things went along just fine, and we came to this church when we moved up to Winnetka, and this was a very comfortable place. And we loved it, and I still love the place. And one of the things that I got to do, as I said earlier, I think I was the lay leader of the congregation. This is how desperate for leadership the congregation was at that point, right? It's like certain people get elected president when there's no one else around, and certain people get elected as the lay leader of the congregation, and that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. I did other things. I was on the executive committee. I was involved in adult ed. One of the things that happened, and Denny Cousins, God bless her, it was Denny, myself, and I think Liz Butler. We were kind of the troika of the adult education committee at that time. And so we hit on the idea of, bringing in outside speakers is great, but we can't always get what we want, and it's expensive, and all the rest of it. So let's do it ourselves. We'll use my dad's garage. We'll put on a show, right? But we had this room, so we did that. So I was assigned to do something. Actually, I think I volunteered for it, and somebody said, "Well, let's do something on the Psalms." Psalm, that's not offensive to anybody. Let's do the Psalms. I said, great. So I had a passing familiarity with the Psalms. There's 150 of them, and so what I did is if you take someone with my approach to things, I really dug in, and I really started reading, and so I find out that probably not all of them were written by David, but quite a few of them probably were. There's one, I think it's Psalm 90, that's attributed to Moses of all people. I don't know, you can't prove all this. And then there are some that were probably just picked up by temps, and written by somebody who kind of had the program in hand. So I started digging through this stuff. So in order, in my view, and I managed to persuade an adult ed group about this, I think to understand the Psalms, you really sort of have to understand who David was. Well, to understand who David was is a big job. And I read all sorts of books. I read 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and I saw, and this is the sort of thing that you could use in a business class, like in an MBA program. David was anointed as king while Saul was still king. So think of it as you're in a publicly held company. The CEO is doing his or her job, and then you're designated as the heir apparent. That seems like a very awkward situation, and that's what you had in 1st and 2nd Samuel. You had King Saul, who was the a member of the tribe of Benjamin. He was the George Washington of his era. Literally stood head and shoulders above everyone else. Matinee idol, handsome, fierce warrior. The ladies loved him, and the people were clamoring for a king. So now you've got to dial back and say, well, why were they clamoring for a king? So now you have to go back to the book of Judges. And so when the people came into the promised land, stick with me, Jeffrey, there was a leadership gap. Moses was dead. Joshua was his successor. And what they did is they installed this system of judges. Now, they're not judges as we understand judges. They were religious leaders. And they also, had office hours and adjudicated, disputes and so forth. But they were supposed to be channeling what God had in store for the people. And so you had this string of judges. I think there were about 20 of them. Samson was one of the judges. I believe Samuel was the last of the judges. And the people started to look around, and they went to Samuel, who was the current judge, and said, we want to be like all the other people. We want a king. And Samuel said, you really sure you want a king? Because that's really not the smartest thing to do. And Samuel spoke to the Lord, and the Lord said, it's not the best idea, but if they want a king, okay, I'll give them a king. And Samuel went back and said, look, if you want a king, we'll give you a king. But what that'll mean is, your sons and daughters will have to work for him. The king will take all your flocks and your lands, and he'll be impossible to deal with. But we want a king. Okay. So Samuel said, you want a king? I'll give you a king. And it was Saul. And Saul worked out really great until he disobeyed. Well, I won't get into all the details of that, but he spared some of the Amalekites and didn't kill them all the way he was supposed to, and that sounds sort of grim, so we won't go into that. But what that meant was the Lord was going to take the spirit away from Saul and give it to someone else, and that was David. So as I was reading all of this, so you can kind of do this as a kind of a narrative and say, well, this is what happened, and boy, this literature is really great. But I was arrested by how authentic God's voice was through all of this. Like, this is really, these are acts that God had to have understood the impact on the people, and what kind of impact this was going to have on the people. And God really meant it for good. But he had his own plan. And our job, it occurred to me then, was not to change God's plan, but to understand God's plan and fit within it. So, just a quick statement about that. It's like when we pray, it's like we can treat God like an ATM or a slot machine. Like, this is what I want. Or we can say, God, help me to understand what it is that you want, and help me to fulfill what it is that you want. Help me to do the best job I can to put up with what you want me to do. So, what that experience gave me was a renewed understanding of the relationship between humanity and God, Jesus' role in it, and my role as a faithful person. And where I found myself was, I think I may have gotten to the point where I really need to take another look at the Catholic Church. Because in my estimation, and you can agree or disagree, the Catholic tradition was the one that remained most faithful to the kind of the continuing relationship between human beings and God. And Catholic, after all, is a Greek word that means universal, and it's really intended for everyone. It got, got politicized somewhere in the 16th century. Luther and his 95 Theses. In fact, today Luther would be seen as a kind of a mainstream Catholic. For the day he wasn't. He had some issues about the way the church was raising money and selling indulgences and things like that. So it opened my eyes in my estimation again. And what I did was I started to look around. And what happened in 2009, which was kind of the key, this was the third call. Third call. Mm-hmm. Was a close friend of ours took his own life, and he was a member of the Catholic Church. And I remember going to the funeral at Faith, Hope, and Charity Parish. And what occurred to me was, and this was, I'd been to Catholic Masses before, this was obviously special. But this time I was keenly aware of how like the Jewish liturgy the Catholic Mass was. It was like, somebody must be kidding around with me. How could it be? You had the Word, then you had the other parts of the service that were occupied now by the Eucharist. But you had all these things that seemed so much in parallel. I wondered, how is this possible? This is not accidental. There's a plan at work here. And so I paid very close attention to the Mass, and I felt very comfortable with it. Then someone else passed away a couple of weeks later, and I went to that funeral Mass, and then it was like, okay, I can't deal with this anymore by ignoring it. So I went to a friend of mine who I knew was a faithful Catholic member of that parish, and I said, how do I find out more? Now, it wasn't like I need to immediately be admitted into the church, but it was like, I want to find out more. Okay, Well, there's something called the RCIA. It's the Rite of Catholic Initiation for Adults. It's essentially an intensive Sunday school that goes on for about a year. And I went into that program. And it started on a Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock. On Saturday night around dinner time, I told my wife that, hey, listen, I'm going to this thing tomorrow at 3 o'clock. And I said, you want to come? I said, what is it? And I told her, she said, okay. And you can ask her why she said yes. I think she wanted to make sure that it wasn't some sort of, wackadoodle cult experience. So she wanted to come basically to protect me. But I don't know for sure, but she said, but she's told me that, I went because I honored what you were thinking, and I just wanted to see what you were up to. So that's the path. And as I say, I didn't know I was on a path while I was traveling it. And, we came into the church in 2010, December 6th. After that time, we both became...
December 9th, 2009?
December 6th of 2010, because the program
2010.
takes a whole year.
Okay.
And because Barbara had been married before, we had to get, we had to kind of shave off some of the rough edges that allowed for both of us to come in through the marriage tribunal. And, been there ever since, and we jumped in with both feet. It's all 4 feet, both of us, and we became catechists, we became Eucharistic ministers, we became lectors, really functioning in the faith life. First, the Faith Open Charity, then we moved to Sacred Heart a couple of years ago. And the only thing I can say is, well, not the only thing, but what I will say is the sort of the openness and really it's kind of the openness and the ability to tolerate a lot of different views that I found in this place, in WCC, gave me the freedom to look and ultimately, elect to follow that path. And I remember as a participant in new member classes here in this room, I remember, we have the newsprint, and we would sort of take a census of like, okay, what faith traditions do you come from? And without fail, over and over and over, 50% and more were either active or former Catholics. And you had blended families, like one partner, is Presbyterian, another is a Catholic, and so, we meet in the middle, we come to WCC over and over and over again. And I just identify that as an artifact of the openness of this place. And ironically, when we went to lunch with the senior pastor at the time, Joe Shank, and told him that what we were up to and where we were going, and his jaw dropped. He was, I think, sad to lose us, but I think I appreciated the irony that the openness of this place allowed us to leave it. But we leave it only in the sense that we worship at another place, but we have a great feeling of warmth for this place.
Sam, I want to thank you for that awesome story you just shared. And it fills me with a lot of joy and delight because you have taken your faith journey seriously. You've been earnest in your pursuit of holy things. This has not been a casual journey, a path for you. It's been one that you've been open-eyed and open-hearted about. You've been open to God's call at these 3 times, and probably you're still open to God's call even now. And I hope that folks who've been listening in and watching on the internet are also asking themselves, how does Sam's story resonate with my own? And am I as open to the Spirit's call as Sam has been? But I'd like you to maybe address a couple of other things about your faith journey. Faith journeys always have twists and turns, and some of them are challenging, and then others are just filled with bliss, almost. On the side of challenges and obstacles, what has been difficult for you in your spiritual journey, and what continues to be a challenge, either intellectually or just in terms of living the faith on a daily basis? And then secondly, what gives you great joy and delight in the spiritual journey that you're on right now?
So thank you for that reaction. I guess I would expect no less, but all right, so two-part question, right? So what are the challenges? So some of the early challenges were, well, what is my family going to think? And I, frankly, this is going to sound a little harsh, I didn't really care what they were going to think, because you know, and again, I'm a big fan of irony. You know, for the child of Holocaust survivors to walk this path is unusual, but not unique. There are others who have. So I'm not going to pat myself on the back for that. But I'm just going to say that you know, it's had some moments where, you know, there's been some friction. But as I said, for me, the stakes were high enough that I was willing to tolerate that for myself. You know, and another one it was, you know, what are people going to think? So for the longest time, I really didn't talk about this. And then I started to, because I think that if you can't be an effective witness with the people you know, how can you be an effective witness with people who are hostile? And after all, I think that's, you know, the Gospel of Matthew says you got to go do that. You have to be a witness to everyone. You know, I had to overcome that, and it turned out not to be that hard. But I'll share with you an anecdote that sort of knits the answer to the first question to the answers I'll give you to the second question, you know, like challenges and joys. So some friends of ours who were members of the parish, who I had known from another context, who were at the Mass where we were admitted into the church. You know, we were walking out, and Molly said to me, "Oh, it's so great to have you in the church, but why now of all times in history, to come to the church?" And I said, "Well, I wanted to get in when the stock price was low." And of course that's silly, but it's like, why not? And so one of the challenges has been, you know, the church has taken a lot of hits, and you know, the priest abuse scandal has been, you know, miserable. And all I'll say about that in the church's defense, and they don't need me to defend them, is I think the church has had overall in the last few years, an approach that's had a lot of integrity to it, and you know, been willing to acknowledge what's going on. And when you compare that to other walks of life, scouting, athletics, the gymnastics program at Michigan State, and on and on and on, I think the church has been faster and a little more honest about it, and probably the numbers compare very favorably with some of these other areas of life that have run into this problem, which is a human problem. It is not uniquely a Catholic problem. Yeah, I think the Catholic hierarchy, you know, was a little bit insular, and I think they've kind of gotten over that. But the joys are immeasurable, because what I can see is kind of a long path of faithful people from thousands of years ago, many centuries ago, and I see it expressed, you know, in the daily Mass, which unfortunately, because of current circumstances, I can't attend. But those joys are endless. And you know, one of the great things about the Mass, and I don't want to make this a public service announcement for Catholicism, unless of course you think it is, you know, the way that the readings knit together. You know, there's an Old Testament reading, a New Testament reading, and then the Gospel reading. Is just how God continues to speak in ways that are discernible to however humans have developed at that particular time. So, you know, I'll kind of close this by discernment the ability to listen, the ability to respond to a call is, I think, what all of us have to do is hone your ability to listen and discern. See what is of God in whatever you're doing, and see what comes from some other source, and try to be able to tell the difference. And if you do nothing more than that, you'll be living a good life.
Thank you. You spoke about the joy aspect as being something intrinsic to you. However, joy is also translated into good works as a response to God's grace, as Luther taught and as all Christians teach these days. Can you say just a brief word about something else I know is very important to you, and that is your work with Catholic Charities? And that will round out our conversation today.
Yeah, so how does that joy show up in corporeal works? Well, so I am a volunteer with Chicago, with Catholic Charities of Chicago Legal Assistance, which was, like a lot of things, completely accidental. There was someone in our office who said there's a continuing legal education seminar. You get like 8 hours of CLE credit. We lawyers have to rack up these things every year. She says, okay, fine. So, and I said, who's doing it? Catholic Charities. I said, oh, well, that's right in my sweet spot. Let's go do that. So I did that, took a day-long seminar involving, how to interface with people of limited means and, how to be of service to them. And when that was concluded, I got a request from somebody in the program who said, well, would you like to start volunteering? I said, yeah, okay, sure. And I did. And I still do that. That's been now almost 10 years. And I participate in something called the Tuesday Evening Supper, where homeless people come to the St. Vincent Center on North LaSalle Street. They get a meal, they're treated with dignity, and they get the chance, if they need it, to speak with a lawyer. And we have volunteer lawyers, people from different law firms, and I'm there on most second Tuesdays of the month. And that is a joy, being able to interface with these people and give them maybe 45 minutes worth of keen listening and dignity and helping them to solve their legal problems, which, believe it or not, people of limited means and homeless have legal problems that maybe aren't the same as the ones that you have, but they're just as annoying. And so, it's a real joy to be able to make a difference with those folks.
I want to thank our guest today, Sam Fifer, for being with us. Sam, it was an awesome conversation. And again, as you experience Sam's story today, consider what it means to you. Think about your own journey, some of your own challenges and joys, the ways that you have listened for God's call and are still listening for that call and experiencing that presence. Continue watching your email for our spiritual enrichment updates, and we will send you information, ways that you can plug into our spiritual enrichment ministry here at Winnetka Congregational Church, especially during these days when we are not able to meet face-to-face. Let's continue to join together heart to heart and in our prayer life with one another, holding one another in heart and mind during these days. Thank you for joining us today.